There's a building technique that used almost no nails, could be taken apart log by log and rebuilt somewhere else, and kept families warm through Manitoba winters 200 years ago. It was invented by the Metis people along the Red River, and today almost nobody is building with it. Only 4 of these original houses survive in North Dakota. A handful more stand in Manitoba, and by the end of this video, I am going to show you why this nearly extinct method might be one of the smartest ways to build a tiny home in 2026, and the one number that tells you whether it is actually cheaper than a stick frame build or a trap you do not want to walk into. Before we get into it, hit subscribe and tap that bell. This channel breaks down real historic building methods and turns them into buildable tiny home plans. No fluff, no sponsorships, just what actually works. If you want the full breakdown of what a Red River frame tiny home costs in 2026, what it takes to get one legally approved, and where in North America you could actually build one, stay with me, because the reveal at the end of this video is going to change how you think about log construction entirely. Let's start with what this technique even is, because it is not a log cabin in the way most people picture one. A traditional log cabin stacks full-length logs horizontally on top of each other, notched at the corners so the whole structure locks together the way a Lincoln log set does. Red River frame construction, also called post on sill or piece, works on a completely different principle. You start with a horizontal sill log running along the top of the foundation. Then you erect vertical posts at every corner and at regular intervals along each wall, usually every 6 to 8 feet. Each of those posts has a groove cut into it, running the full height of the post, almost like the channel a sliding door rides in. Short, squared logs are then slid into those grooves horizontally, one on top of another, until the entire wall is filled in from sill to roofline. Picture a bookshelf standing on its end, and the logs are the books sliding in from the side. That is essentially the mechanics of a Red River frame wall. Because the logs are captured in a groove rather than nailed or notched together, the whole wall could be assembled with hand tools and almost no metal hardware. The gaps between the individual logs were packed with chinking, a mixture of mud, hay, and horsehair, sometimes with lime added for durability, to seal out the wind and hold in heat. The roof structure sat on top of this post and log wall system, typically a simple gable frame, and the whole building could be raised by a small crew working with axes, augers, and handsaws, no sawmill required. This technique was developed by the Metis, the mixed indigenous and European community that formed around the fur trade economy in what is now Manitoba and North Dakota. Historians trace its structural roots to French-Canadian building methods practiced along the St. Lawrence River Valley in Quebec, technology that Hudson's Bay Company employees carried west with them in the early 1800s. Metis builders took that French-Canadian joinery and adapted it into something distinctly their own, refined for the materials and climate of the Red River settlement. It became so associated with the region that surveyors and settlers simply started calling it Red River frame, sometimes Manitoba frame, and by the early 1800s, it was the dominant construction method across the Red River settlement, used for houses, trading posts, churches, and public buildings alike, right up until roughly 1870. Here is what made this method genuinely clever, not just historically interesting. Because the logs were not nailed in place, a Red River frame building could be disassembled piece by piece and reconstructed at an entirely new site. Families who needed to relocate, whether for better farmland, a shift in fur trade routes, or a dispute over a land claim, could take their house with them log by log rather than starting from scratch. That is a portability advantage that almost no conventional building method offers today, and it is exactly the kind of feature modern tiny home builders now chase with wheels and a steel trailer chassis. The Metis were solving the same mobility problem centuries earlier, just with joinery instead of an axle. It also solved a real supply chain problem. Nails were expensive, imported, and hard to source out on the frontier, often carried in by canoe or Red River cart over hundreds of miles. A construction method that relied on interlocking wood joinery instead of metal fasteners meant a family did not need a blacksmith or a shipment from Montreal just to put a roof over their heads. Everything you needed, aside from the chinking materials, could be harvested and shaped on site with an axe, an auger, and a saw. And because the load-bearing structure was the post and groove frame rather than the individual logs themselves, builders could construct multi-story buildings, something that is much harder to do safely with a stacked log cabin, where every log has to carry the full weight of everything above it. Riel House and several buildings at Lower Fort Garry are 1.5 to 2 stories, which tells you this was never viewed as a technique limited to small single-room cabins. It was a legitimate structural system capable of scaling up. The technique had one real weakness, and it is worth being honest about it rather than only celebrating the clever parts. As the wood dried out and shrank with the seasons, particularly through the extreme temperature swings of a prairie winter, the chinking between the logs could crack and pull away from the wood. That let cold air infiltrate the wall assembly, and buildings needed regular re-chinking, sometimes annually, to stay properly sealed. That ongoing maintenance burden is part of why the style eventually lost out to balloon framing and dimensional lumber once steam-powered sawmills became common across the prairies in the later 1800s. Balloon framing did not require anywhere near the skilled hand joinery, and it did not need yearly maintenance to stay weathertight. Red River frame construction was a brilliant solution to the constraints of its era, but once those constraints disappeared, so did most of the reasons to keep building this way. Very few original Red River frame buildings are still standing anywhere in North America, which is part of what makes this such a compelling story for a tiny home audience. In Manitoba, the Riel House, associated with the family of Louis Riel and built around 1880, is preserved as a National Historic Site of Canada and still displays the pièce sur pièce coulisse joinery in its walls, with horizontal logs fitted into vertical groove posts and the gaps originally filled with a clay and straw mixture. Lower Fort Garry, also in Manitoba, preserves several additional buildings using this same construction method, giving you more than one surviving example within a short drive of Winnipeg if you ever want to see this joinery in person rather than just on a screen. Across the border in Pembina County, North Dakota, the State Historical Society has documented 4 surviving Red River frame structures dating to the fur trade era. That group includes the Gingras Trading Post and the adjacent Gingras House, the Dees Martineau House near Leroy, and the Kitson Cabin in Valhalla. These 4 buildings, all within a few miles of one another, are considered among the last remaining structures anywhere representative of this specific regional building tradition. Restoration work on the Gingras site has been carried out by local contractors, including Kobila Brothers Construction, who have worked to stabilize and repair the original tenon and groove log walls hidden underneath later exterior siding, uncovering construction details that had not been visible for decades. That is essentially the complete list. A technique that once housed an entire regional economy, from trading posts to family homes to churches, now survives in a small handful of preserved and restored buildings split between 2 states and 1 Canadian province. So the question this video is actually built around is simple. Is there any real path to bringing this back as a modern, livable tiny home, or is it a beautiful piece of history that belongs behind museum glass and nowhere else? That is what the rest of this video is going to answer. And the answer is more interesting than a simple yes or no. Here is where I have to be straight with you, because this channel does not do hype. There is currently no company mass producing Red River frame tiny homes the way you can order a Scandinavian cabin kit or a barn-dominium shell from a catalog. This is not a product category with builders competing for your business or a factory shipping panelized kits to your lot. What you're looking at is a specific historic joinery technique. And if you want a tiny home built this way in 2026, you are either building it yourself or hiring a timber frame specialist willing to adapt their existing post and beam process to it. That second option is more realistic than it sounds. Post and groove construction is a close cousin of modern timber framing, which is very much alive as an industry across North America. Timber frame builders like Riverbend Timber Framing already design smaller, contemporary post and beam homes and have leaned into compact floor plans as more clients look to build on tighter budgets and smaller lots. The underlying engineering principle is the same family of technology. vertical posts carrying the structural load, with infill material filling the space between them. Swapping stacked solid timber infill for modern insulated panel infill, while keeping the exposed post and groove joinery as the visual signature, is a realistic custom build that an experienced timber frame shop could actually quote you, even if they have never heard the phrase Red River frame before you called them. What you are really doing when you build a modern version of this house is constructing a hybrid. You keep the post and groove joinery as the visual and structural signature, because that exposed vertical post with horizontal infill is what makes it a Red River frame building and not just another log cabin or a generic timber frame home. Then you modernize everything happening behind that log wall to meet 2026 energy code, because nobody wants to be out there rechinking a tiny home every spring the way settlers did in 1860. The look stays historic. The performance has to be current. There is also a genuine do-it-yourself path here, and it is worth naming honestly. If you already have basic timber framing or carpentry skills, cutting a groove post with a router jig or a chainsaw mill is a learnable skill, not an impossible one. And there are timber framing guilds and workshops across the upper Midwest and the Canadian prairies that teach traditional joinery techniques, including variants of this exact method. It is a slower, more physically demanding path than hiring a shop, and it will not save you as much money as you might hope once you account for the value of your own time. But it is the closest thing to an authentic recreation of how these buildings actually went up in the first place. If you are building under 400 square feet, you're likely working under the tiny house provisions in the International Residential Code, and it is worth getting the terminology exactly right here, because it has changed more than once. That provision started as Appendix Q in the 2018 edition of the IRC, was renamed Appendix AQ in the 2021 edition, and has been renumbered again to Appendix BB in the most recent code cycle. Many local building departments are still working off an older code edition, so depending on where you're building, your inspector might reference Appendix Q, Appendix AQ, or Appendix BB for the exact same set of tiny house allowances. Always ask your local building department which edition of the IRC they have adopted before you assume which appendix letter applies to your project. Whichever letter it goes by, this appendix relaxes ceiling height minimums and loft egress rules to make small footprint living legal, but it does not relax structural requirements, and that matters enormously here because historic log joinery was never engineered to a modern structural code in the first place. It was engineered by trial, error, and generations of accumulated craft knowledge, which is a very different thing from stamp calculation. A licensed structural engineer will need to size your posts, your groove depth, and your infill log dimensions to meet current wind and snow load requirements for your specific location, because a technique refined by hand in the 1850s was never stress-tested against a modern engineering standard. In cold climates especially, expect your building department to also want documentation showing how you are meeting current insulation code, which almost certainly means you cannot rely on mud and horsehair chinking as your only thermal barrier the way builders did 2 centuries ago. Most modern log and timber builds handle this by adding a continuous layer of rigid insulation or a structural insulated panel behind the log wall, which conveniently also solves the historic weak point of this entire technique, the chinking cracking open every winter and letting cold air straight through. If you're placing this on a permanent foundation rather than a trailer, IRC Section R302.1 governs exterior wall fire separation distance from your property line, and log walls do not get any kind of fire rating exemption just because they look rustic and historic. You will want your local building department involved early in the process, not after you have already ordered timber and committed to a groove pattern that might not pass inspection. There's one more technical reality that most people researching this style online never mention, and it is a big one if you were picturing this on wheels. Solid horizontal log infill is heavy. A wall built from true, squared timber logs, even at tiny home dimensions, can weigh several times what a conventional insulated stick frame wall weighs for the same square footage. That weight has to go somewhere, and on a foundation, it simply transfers straight down into properly engineered footings, which is a solved problem. On a trailer, it is a completely different story. Tiny house trailers are engineered around fairly tight axle weight ratings, And a genuine solid log Red River frame wall system will blow past those ratings fast, especially once you add a roof, interior finishes, and appliances on top of it. Unless you swap the solid horizontal timbers for lightweight timber-clad insulated panels, engineered to mimic the look of the joinery without the mass of real squared logs. This is strictly a foundation build. If a towable tiny home is non-negotiable for you, this specific technique, built authentically, is not the right style to chase. That is not a small footnote. It is one of the most important filters for deciding whether this project is even feasible for your situation. Now for the number that matters more than any other number in this video. Custom timber frame construction in North America is currently running in the range of $200 to $400 per square foot for the frame and shell alone, before interior finishing, and that range depends heavily on your region, the timber species you choose, and how much of the joinery is cut by hand versus by CNC timber framing equipment. Hand-cut joinery costs more in labor. CNC-cut joinery costs more in setup and machine time, but less in skilled labor hours. Either way, you are paying a real craftsmanship premium compared to a framing crew nailing together dimensional lumber. A small Red River frame, tiny home in the 300 to 400 square foot range, built with modern insulation behind traditional post and groove log infill, realistically lands somewhere in the $90,000 to $160,000 range fully finished. Once you account for the foundation, mechanical systems, electrical and plumbing rough-in, and a complete interior build-out. That is not a rough guess pulled from nowhere. It is consistent with what custom timber frame shops are quoting for small footprint projects across the industry right now in 2026. That is meaningfully more than a comparable stick frame tiny home, which can often be finished in the $60,000 to $100,000 range depending on the finishes you choose. The premium you're paying on top of that baseline is for hand-fit joinery, a specialty timber framer who actually knows how to cut a groove post correctly, and a build type that very few contractors anywhere have ever actually attempted. If your budget is the primary driver behind this project, I want to be honest with you right now. This is not your cheapest path to a tiny home, and it is not close. If what you actually want is a genuinely unique, historically rooted structure with exposed timber character that a factory-built tiny home simply cannot replicate, no matter how nice the finishes are, the premium buys you something a stick frame home cannot fake, no matter how good the siding looks in photos. This build makes the most sense for a fairly specific set of people, and I would rather narrow that down honestly than pretend this is for everyone watching. First, someone in Manitoba, North Dakota, or the broader Red River Valley region who wants a build with genuine regional and cultural roots, not an imported aesthetic borrowed from a country their family has no connection to. There is something meaningfully different about building in the actual tradition of the land you're building on. Second, someone who already has access to timber and basic joinery skills, or who is genuinely willing to apprentice under a timber framer for a season, since a huge share of the cost premium here comes from skilled labor rather than raw materials. If you can supply some of that labor yourself, the economics shift meaningfully in your favor. Third, someone is building a permanent foundation set structure rather than a towable tiny home on wheels. Because as we just covered, the weight of a true log infill wall makes this a poor candidate for trailer-based tiny living unless you are willing to compromise on authenticity with lightweight panel infill instead of real timber. If you were hoping this was going to be a lightweight, budget-friendly, build-it-yourself-in-a-weekend kind of project, it is not, and I would genuinely rather tell you that clearly right now than have you found that out after you have already ordered timber and committed to a foundation. So here's the answer to the question I opened this video with. Is Red River frame construction actually a smart way to build a tiny home in 2026? The honest answer is yes, but only if you value authenticity and craftsmanship over speed and budget, and only if you're building on a permanent foundation rather than chasing a towable trailer build. This is not a trend you can buy into with a kit and a weekend, and it is not the cheapest way to get into a tiny home by a wide margin. What it is instead is a nearly lost regional building tradition that a small number of skilled timber framers could genuinely revive for you, provided you're willing to pay a real craftsmanship premium and put in the structural engineering work required to bring 1850s hand joinery up to a 2026 stamp code standard. What makes this different from almost every other historic style I have covered on this channel is that there is no company anywhere waiting to sell you one off the shelf. There is no catalog, no kit, no factory floor churning these out. If you actually want this house, you're going to be one of the small number of people helping to bring an entire regional building tradition back from the edge of disappearing completely. That is either the single most exciting part of this whole project, or it is the biggest reason to walk away and choose something more established instead. And honestly, only you know which one of those describes you. If you want me to track down a timber framer actually willing to quote a Red River frame tiny home build for a viewer of this channel, or if you want the next video to cover another lost North American building style before it disappears completely, let me know in the comments below. And if this video just taught you something you did not know 200 years of prairie history was quietly hiding, hit subscribe, because uncovering exactly that kind of forgotten building knowledge is what this channel does every single week.